Hi, Richard Marker at the Wise Philanthropy Channel, a project of the Institute for Wise Philanthropy. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Today, I'd like to talk about public policy in the United States philanthropy and the role of advocacy within that context. So let's go back a step. Uh, One of the things that I'm asked frequently when I travel around the world and talk about philanthropy is how did American philanthropy get to be so sophisticated? How do you have all these institutions? How can we develop systems like that in our country? And I've been asked that question in France, and I've been asked that question in Japan, and I've been asked that question in all sorts of places. Truth be told, when people ask me that question, I tell them to hold on a second. Before romanticizing American philanthropy, I ask them, wait a second, American philanthropy came into existence to respond to needs that your country doesn't have. What is that? Well, for example, could you imagine in your country having to pay $50,000 a year to go to university? Impossible. Could you imagine in your country that you would be totally dependent on your employer to provide health care at some affordable basis? No. How can you say such a thing? Could you imagine that your vacation, the right to a vacation, or right to maternity or paternity leave, or a right to retirement funds is dependent on your own initiative or the goodwill of your employer? No, I can't imagine that, they would all say to me. I said, well, then before you romanticize the American philanthropy system, pause for a second and understand that the American philanthropy system emerged out of a very different reality and responds to a very different set of needs. So before getting into the issue of advocacy and public policy, I want to go back a little bit and give you a précis of a précis. Those of you who are watching, who have taken courses with me at either NYU or at Penn or independently through your own foundation or in a regional association, may have heard a more extended 1.5 to 2 hour presentation on the history of American philanthropy. Well, this is going to be a very succinct summary of one or two key points of that presentation. But it's an important backdrop to understanding why I believe so strongly that public policy advocacy is now a mandate. So to get there, it's important to understand that most of the industrialized world, other than the United States, followed the Napoleonic concept of how a society is supposed to be put together. And that is that the society has a responsibility to its citizens. And what does that mean? It means that, as I said before, there's education and there's healthcare and there's retirement and there's all sorts of basic kinds uh, of life needs that are the responsibility of the government. The society, after all, the government is, in theory, is only a society, and we pay for that through our taxes. But it means that everyone is included. One doesn't have to create a special safety net. The safety net is there automatically. The education is there automatically. In the United States, um, we developed a system not so much on the responsibility of the society to the individual, but rather the rights of the individual vis-a-vis the society and the government. And therefore, as we still see played out today in a kind of distorted fashion, I must say, is radical individualism that goes so far as to say, what right does government have to tell me anything? Uh, uh, and and now that was the starting point of the distinction between the American system and much of the rest of the world. It didn't take long, though. I'm just going to do this absolutely quickly. It didn't take long for people to realize it doesn't always work. If your house is on fire, you can't just, I have radical individualism, I'm going to take my own bucket and put it out. So there are volunteer fire departments, or if you want people to have an education, it's awfully difficult to self-educate consistently beyond a certain point. And so many other examples, or healthcare is a better example. Not everybody's a doctor. It didn't take long for hospitals to need to be created. Those were basis of volunteers coming together to say we need something beyond what we as individuals can do on our own. But for the earliest assumption was that the volunteer sector could take care of those things. The volunteer sector could manage to provide healthcare. The volunteer sector could manage to provide food care. The volunteer sector could manage to take care of frail elderly. Uh, and the society was smaller. It was divided and structured in a very different way, and the needs of those systems were far less complex than they are today. The history of American society showed that over the years, well into the 20th century, the assumption was that gradually more and more things would be understood to be the responsibility of the government based on our taxes. So therefore, big cities don't have volunteer fire departments; they have professional fire departments. The hospitals are no longer exclusively the domain of religious organizations, but they have other sorts of support, including government support. Education, how much education should be free and who should be included is still an open debate. But the fact of the matter is that in the United States, every state now guarantees public education through high school. Once again, this is not the context to talk about all the debates that are going on in American society today about charter schools and things like that. But in general, there's an assumption that every child going through high school has a right to a free education. And so that there's been an expansion of those roles. And certainly in the mid 20th century, we had Social Security, which somehow said that the government has a responsibility through money that you would contribute from your paycheck, that when you retire, there will be some money for you, or that when you retire, there's going to be healthcare for you because there's no longer going to be an employer to provide those kinds of things. So that the pattern has been to go from zero government support to greater government support. Now, let's be clear. Almost every other society begins its government support at a much higher level than the United States does. Even in the days of the Great Society, and even in the days when we talked about expanding government support, rarely were people advocating for the kind of support that took place in Napoleonic countries. The expectation that higher education, for example, would be largely dependent on individuals and private support. The religious institutions would still depend on private support. The ability of hospitals to provide all sorts of services would go beyond what private support or even what insurance could provide. So we've always had the assumption that there's an important role for private philanthropy that went along even with an expanded government role. The important reason to tell you that background before we get to what I think is the greatest takeaway here is that the reliance on private philanthropy has always been there, even when the government has stepped in at our wish. The government only does it does what we pay our taxes for it to do for us when it's working well. Now, in the last generation or so, and I don't want to get too caught up in the politics or the details of the history, there's been a question that some people in American society have had about whether that has gone too far, or whether in fact that is still the role of government, or whether it should be the role of government. And so there are segments of the American polity that have urged pulling back on support for even basic services such as public education, or whether or not even Social Security should continue to exist as a government commitment, or Medicare, and so forth. And even as we sit here today, there are still people fighting against the legitimacy of the Affordable Care Act, saying that no, individuals in American society don't have a right to health care, that should be an individual's responsibility, or if they can negotiate that with their employer, it's something they can share with their employer. And if they can't afford insurance, some would say, too bad for them. Let them turn to their philanthropy. Let them turn to their religious institutions. One of the things that we've seen, though, is that in fact, those private volunteer institutions don't have the capacity to provide the totality of the needs of a society as large, complex, and as ours. There's no way that philanthropy can feed everyone who has food insecurity. There's no way that philanthropy, through even the most generous way we imagine it, can take care of the health needs of people who otherwise cannot afford their own hospitalization or their own medical care. There is literally no way that volunteerism can take the place of providing support when people have lost their jobs and or retirement or any of those kinds of things. The nature of American society is such that even here, with this great commitment of the rights of individuals, we have a profound reliance, legitimate reliance, on the capacity of government, which far exceeds the capacity of private philanthropy. In another setting, we can go into some of the data on that. But suffice it to say that if you look at something like the NIH, which is a government-supported foundation, as it were, which makes grants. Well, the number of grants, that the amount of money that the NIH gives out each year is about 4 to 5 times larger than the amount of money that the largest private foundation in the world gives out every year. So that's just one perspective, and we can give lots more data that shows that as generous and as important as private philanthropy is, and it's how I spend my life, it's important to understand that it's always within the context. So now I want to move on to why I think it's now a mandate. You see, private philanthropy came into existence, and the structures of private philanthropy came into existence as a way to somehow say the society has a responsibility to those who are in need. Some of those needs are core services such as healthcare or education. Some of those may be more quality of life, such as museums or music. But nevertheless, there's a recognition going back a couple of centuries and go all the way up into the 20th century that private philanthropy has a role to play in making sure that certain kinds of needs of the society are provided. But one of the things that we recognize is that we can't do it alone. And not only can we not do it alone, but every gift that we make, whether we do it as an individual who may be a charitable individual with a small amount of money, or a large philanthropist with millions and millions and millions of dollars, every gift that we make is in some ways a public policy statement. If you give to a soup kitchen, if you give to a food pantry, and you don't support advocacy for greater support for SNAP funding, then in a way you are making a political statement whether you intend to or not. If you are choosing to support a park, a public park in one neighborhood, which happens only to be for wealthy whites, and you don't give any money to a park which is in a more underprivileged area, which happens to be more racially diverse or ethnically diverse, you may not think about that as a public policy question, but unless you are advocating that the government make sure that that support is available across the board, you are implicitly making a value judgment of public policy. And that is to say, you don't really care about the equality, the equity of the funding that's provided in society. You care about your own particular interests. That's okay, but it's not okay. Because it runs counter to why we had private philanthropy in the first place. Private philanthropy in the United States originally said, we have an obligation to make sure that the needs of everyone are taken care of. Right now in the 21st century, the needs of the capacity of private philanthropy is far inadequate to provide for the needs of the largest number of people for all sorts of reasons. And while we as funders can play a key role in providing some risk capital, or providing supplementary care, or providing specialized kinds of interest, or providing or being deeply involved in creating communities and movements, or religious institutions, those are things that we certainly can do. But to think that somehow we can voluntarily put enough cans on that soup kitchen that are going to feed all the food insecure in this country, or that we somehow can make enough private contributions so that the hospital is going to be able to provide in-depth care for those who have COVID-19, or for those who have basic heart problems, or those who are or just go in for an appendectomy. It's the height of naivete to think that that can ever be solved in this society by even the most generous and the most ambitious vision of what private philanthropy is about. Now, make no mistake, I believe strongly that there are roles for private philanthropy, and I believe that is something that will continue, whether it whether that need should or shouldn't be there. It's always going to be there for the foreseeable future, just as it always has in the past. But to think that that can happen without public policy going along with it is naive and counterproductive. And therefore, it seems to me that if we care about people being fed, if we care about people being healthy, if we care about people being educated, if we care about people having a secure retirement, if we care about people having healthcare, if we care about any of the kinds of range of things that define a healthy society, a society which has a level of equity and equitability to it, we have no choice but to have a component of our funding go to public policy advocacy. Because so what I'm saying at this stage is that in the 21st century, we have an obligation and not simply a choice. It's a mandate and not an option for us to get involved in public policy advocacy if we are to fulfill what it means to be philanthropists and involved in philanthropy in the United States at this time in history. Thanks very much. I look forward to your thoughts, your reactions, and I'm happy to engage it both in this setting and in others as well. So thanks very much for tuning in to the Wise Philanthropy channel and for participating in this this session.